Part 10. The little work cubicle was filled with filing boxes full of 3x5 cards, tapes, small tools, and open plastic crates filled with pieces of rock. Norris sat at the single small desk. A light hung over him, its flexible metal neck bent at a convenient angle, giving it the look of a steel cobra. It shone brightly on the maps the geophysicist was sorting through. Some of the notations on the maps were in Norwegian, some in English. Eventually, he found the chart he was hunting for and placed it above one of the Norwegian maps. He used a black marking pen to make identical notations on both. "Here," he announced confidently. "This is where they were spending most of their time. I cross-checked with their notes. You can figure out the months where they've been written out. They used numeric notation most of the time, though." He continued to make little arrowheads and dots on the maps. MacReady stopped looking over Norris's shoulder and turned at a sound. Bennings poked his head into the room. "Well?" MacReady asked him. "Pretty nasty out, Mac. 35 knots. Any chance it'll let up?" "Hard to say. I wouldn't count on it. There is one good thing, though." "What's that?" "Not much snow in suspension right now. It's pretty clear, and you shouldn't have any icing problems. But it's not what I'd call recreational flying weather." MacReady turned to glance over Norris's shoulder again. "Screw it. I'm going up anyway. I'll take Palmer as a backup, just in case we run into any trouble." His eyes were concentrated on the lower of the two maps, the one with the English markings. "Are you sure we can find that place, Norris?" The geophysicist nodded reassuringly and rose from his chair. "The coordinates are the same on both maps. We'll find it all right." He started rolling the maps together and turned out the Cobra light. Gary entered the rec room, glanced momentarily at the still stunned Clark and the attentive Knowles, then walked over to join Blair in gazing down at the interlocked animal forms. The station manager wore a clean shirt and had just shaved. The Magnum rested in the holster at his belt, cleaned and reloaded. "What have you figured out, Blair?" "Other than a slow way of going nuts? Not much." He picked at the fragments of bandage still attached to one bulging leg. "It sure as hell wasn't anything new that got in from outside." He looked over towards Clark. "I'm sure the kennel was locked when Clark found it. We checked the outside dog door. It was still latched from the inside. It had to be that new dog, the Norwegian dog." Gary looked doubtful and angry. "I just can't comprehend any of this. It was just a dog." A sharp, derisive laugh sounded from the other side of the room. There was no humor in Childs's voice. "Wasn't no dog, Chief. I don't have to have no degree to figure that out." That tape Macready showed us earlier this morning. Blair murmured softly. Couldn't make much of it myself. I've asked him to try and locate the site where they were working. The biologist went on. Where that peculiar oval in the ice was, where the explosion broke their video camera. He's taking Palmer with him, and Norris volunteered to go along. Okay with you? Sure, if you think it's advisable. I'm damned if I can think of anything else to advise. You think there's a connection? Maybe. He turned to stare back down at the table and the enigma it held. Anyhow, like I said, I don't have any other bright ideas. You? The station manager tried to make sense of the insane happenings, but could only shake his head dolefully. The wind flailed the white desert. The chopper bounced and dipped, and only experience and determination kept the men inside her from doing the same. Macready fought the controls as they rode the currents, trying to stay as close to the ground as possible so they wouldn't miss anything, while still leaving enough leeway for evasive action in the event the craft was caught by a downdraft. It was hard work, and you couldn't relax for a minute. The storm had passed quickly, but the crystal clear air was deceptive. The only difference, so far as Macready was concerned, was that when there was no blowing snow or ice, you could have the pleasure of seeing where you were most likely to crash. Palmer occupied the co-pilot's seat, while Norris peered over their shoulders from behind. The geophysicist was pointing at the plastic map taped to the flight console. One of their sites should be directly over here. The one we're after is a few hundred yards further south. I know. Macready leaned on the controls, and the copter heeled over to starboard. A high, even-topped white wall loomed directly ahead. Norris regarded it professionally. The symmetry of the formation hinted that more than normal mountain building activity might be responsible for its formation. The wall might mark the location of a minor fault line or a lava tunnel. Or there might not be any stone present at all if it was a fossil pressure ridge of pure ice. The copter rose and they soared over the wall. On the other side, a flat glacial plain stretched towards distant high mountains. Instantly visible as soon as they cleared the ridge, and marking the center of the white plain like a giant ink spot, was an enormous blackened crater. The lab was full of dead dogs. They lay in macabre row, each carefully tagged on one leg. Clark had eventually recovered his senses sufficiently to assist in the unpleasant work. But the pain finally became too much for him, and he had to flee the room. Each of the dead animals had a name. Each had been a close friend. Fuchs was preparing new slides, which Blair studied under the microscope. 2 cells were visible through the eyepiece. They were active, neither quiescent nor dead. One looked quite normal. Its companion looked anything but. At the moment, the two were joined together by a thin stream of protoplasm. Material from the larger cell, which was long and thin, flowed into the smaller spherical cell. As it did so, the smaller cell swelled visibly, until the cell wall fractured in 3 places. Immediately, the smaller cell assumed a flattened shape, like the other, and 3 new streams of material began to flow outward from its interior. Neither cell appeared to have lost any mass. Blair pulled away from the eyepiece and frowned as he checked his watch. It was running in stopwatch mode. He turned it off. The resulting readout was very puzzling. MacReady bounced the copter a couple of times as he set it down, but neither ship nor passengers showed ill effects. The steady hum of the rotors slowed to a stop. He pulled down his snow goggles and stepped out onto the ice. Norris and Palmer were right behind him. It was a short walk to the fringe of the crater. MacReady paused to kick aside a gnarled chunk of grey metal. The impact reduced it to splintery fragments. Another piece was so big they had to walk around it. The massive hole was more than 15 feet deep, considerably more. The bottom of the crater was lined with charred, blackened metal. Everything was grey or black. The metal fragments were lusterless, dull as antimony, but smooth all the same. MacReady didn't know what to make of a polished surface that was non-reflective. The ice around the rim was as smooth as glass and only recently rouged over with freshly blown snow. What hadn't been blasted away or vaporized had melted. The outline of the hole suggested that it had contained a large sphere. MacReady met Norris's eyes and said nothing. Only Palmer made no pretense of concealing his awe. Wow. Whatever it was big. Look at this. MacReady moved to his left and picked something off the ice. His companions gathered around. Recognize it? He asked them. Palmer shook his head, but Norris nodded quickly. Looks like the remains of a medium-charge thermite canister. Standard military ordnance. NATO uses the same stuff we do. Yeah. MacReady heaved it towards the helicopter, the beginning of a growing collection. They spread out slightly and began to circle the crater. There wasn't much solid debris. Most of what remained was too large to be carried. A fine grey ash lay on the ice and radiated outward from the center of the hole. Norris knelt and took a couple of small plastic tubes from a pocket. Using a small pick, he started taking ice and powder samples from the crater's perimeter. There wasn't much for the 2 pilots to do, except wait for the scientist. Palmer continued to marvel at the size of the crater. Glacial ice this far south was solid as rock. No thermite charge had ripped that wound in the surface. Macready got tired of walking, retraced his steps, and bent over alongside Norris. The geophysicist was examining a small piece of metal. He had a small box out and open. It held tiny vials of reagents and catalysts. A chart full of fine print was glued to the inside of the cover. A few of the words were in English, the rest in rarefied words of many syllables. The syllables were completely alien to him. While he watched, Norris dribbled a little red fluid from one of the vials onto the specimen of debris. Nothing happened, and the fluid ran off into the snow. The contents of a second vial were tried, with the same result. A powerful smell rose from the liquid, and Macready's nose twitched. Norris looked up at him. At first, I thought it was some alloy of magnesium. It's light enough. More than light enough. He carefully wiped the grey splinter against the ice, then the side of his boot. I never saw metal with such a low specific gravity. It has some of the characteristics of metallic lithium, but that's crazy. Stuff like that can't be worked like normal metal. At least, that's what I've been told. He carefully put the last vial he'd utilized back into its slot in the box. That was concentrated sulfuric acid. Might as well have been water for all the effect it had on this. He tapped the fragment with a gloved finger. Yet some it turns to powder if you so much as blow on it. So you don't know what it is? Macready asked. Norris shook his head. Haven't the foggiest. Some kind of alloy. Wish I'd taken more metallurgy. But I'd bet a 2-year sabbatical that this stuff is unique. He turned to give the empty hole a look of disgust. And those poor dumb bastards had to go and blow the hell out of it. Give 'em a break, Norris, Macready said. I'm sure they planted their charges carefully. They were probably just trying to break up enough ice to make digging easy. I guess. Norris didn't sound very understanding. Macready picked up the splinter and gazed at it. Some of it powders, but some, like this piece, resists strong acid. Then how the hell did they blow it up? Something in the metal, or in something that vaporized during the explosion, must have reacted chemically with the thermite. Or maybe it was the heat that did it. I don't know. He took the specimen back from Macready, slipped it into a plastic sample tube, and began writing on it. Macready rose and studied the horizon. There have been a lot of temporary camps set up in this area. Could some outfit, the Soviets or the Australians or somebody, have dug in a short-term station here and then pulled up stakes without taking everything with them? Like what, for instance? You know the big tanks we use to store the fuel for the choppers and the tractor. He gestured towards the crater. Could some group have left one here? The thermite could have set off any remaining gas. Macready was reaching. He knew it, and so did Norris. Sorry, Mac, the geophysicist countered. In the first place, the shape of the crater's all wrong. Next, this ice is glacial, not recent. You don't bury a temporary storage tank under 20 feet of solid ice. Also, propane and gasoline, any kind of fuel, is strictly rationed at any outpost. Nobody would take off and leave a lot of valuable fuel behind. Costs too much to get it down here. Maybe they intended to return. Maybe, but I wouldn't think so. Norris held up a gloveful of chipped ice. This doesn't show any of the telltale signs of having been disturbed. It would if somebody had had a base here. There'd be skid marks at least, even if all they put up were surface quonsets. He rose. Of course, we can check on it when we make contact with McMurdo again. They'd have records of anything that's put down hereabouts. What if the Soviets, or one of the Eastern European consortiums, like the East German-Romanian team, were running a clandestine operation here? Come on, Mac. Norris chided him. There's plenty of ice cover just as interesting as this, a hell of a lot closer to their permanent installations. Yeah. The pilot kicked at the surface, sending particles flying. But maybe there isn't any oil there. Norris considered a moment. Now that's a possibility. He stared evenly at Macready. After a moment, the pilot grinned sheepishly back at him. Yeah, okay, I give in. I don't believe any of that either. His expression turned serious once more. So what do you make of it? You know damn well what we both make of it. No chance it could have been some new kind of test craft. Norris shook his head. No, and for a lot of the same reasons. The ice is too old and too undisturbed. Seismic activity has been shoving this region upward for a long time, not the other way around. He held up another ice sample. It's tough to be certain in the field, but I'd say the ice this thing was buried in is over 100,000 years old. Pleistocene at least. There was a shout from behind them, and both men looked around. Palmer was waving to them. Now what's he found? Wondered Norris. He and Macready walked over to stand alongside the younger man. Palmer was standing some 50 yards from the rim of the crater. A large rectangular chunk of ice had been cut from the surface near his feet. The excavation was some 15 feet long, 6 wide, and about 8 deep, according to Norris's eyeball estimation. All three men stared silently at the hole. There was nothing down there except more ice. Snow whirled around their boots like white laces.